Well, hey there. If you love the gospel story and the kind of art that stirs your soul, you're one of us already. So why not make it official? Join the Rabbit Room membership. By becoming a member, you'll be a partner in everything we create. Books, articles, events, and even podcasts, just like the one you're listening to right now. Plus, you'll enjoy exclusive perks throughout the year, and we'll even send you our classic member mug as our way of saying thank you. Join us today, or learn more at rabbitroom.com/membership.
If we live our lives just pursuing health, we're going to end up disappointed because the question is like, well, what is health for? Then we end up finding that what we're ultimately longing for is in some ways something that can't be satisfied by any particular thing because we have in ourselves this kind of natural desire for God that only God can fill.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Dr. Warren Kinghorn is a psychiatrist and theologian at Duke University, where he holds joint appointments at Duke Divinity School and the Duke University Medical Center. Warren's work focuses on the intersection of theology, mental health, and human flourishing, and he brings an integrated, humane perspective to questions that too often get reduced to biology or technique. His new book is Wayfaring, a Christian approach to mental health care. In this episode, Warren Kinghorn and I discuss how the metaphor of the human being as machine has shaped mental health care and what's gained by reclaiming the older metaphor of the human as wayfarer. We talk about the ways that Thomas Aquinas' theological vision of human behavior opens up a richer account of freedom, agency, and virtue. And we talk about the possibility that the meaning of life is an active participation in blessing. Warren Kinghorn, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. I'm so excited about your book, Wayfaring, subtitle, A Christian Approach to Mental Health.
A Christian Approach to Mental Health Care, and I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is so fun. As I was telling you before we started recording, I just love this book. Maybe we'll just start with, first, give me the 90-second version. When people say, what's your book about, what do you tell them?
Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I love being a psychiatrist. I see things in the modern field of psychiatry that I think extend to the broader field of mental health care, where people can feel like they're being treated like machines that need to be fixed, and they can feel like they're being carried along on a kind of assembly line. And I want to resist that. And I think that Christians have all the resources that we need to resist that. So in place of the image of the human being as a machine, especially the human body or mind as a machine, I draw on St. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher and theologian, to argue for a different image of the human as a wayfarer or pilgrim, and as human life as a journey, and the practices of mental health care as being able to accompany each other on a journey.
Love it. Let's talk about that image of the machine metaphor. What are the dangers? What are the ramifications of thinking of people as machines? I mean, in one sense, it's been pretty helpful to.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been. To think of the human body as a machine, I think has been, it certainly has had its advantages.
That's right. I think there are ways in which picturing the human body as a machine can help us to be able to see things and to. I've been a physician now for over 20 years. I think I benefit in some ways from machine thinking in healthcare as a whole, in medicine specifically. I think there's limits, though, and I think it's important to name that we live in a culture where we're surrounded all the time by machines. So you and I are talking in different cities. We're depending on machines to, allow us to have our conversation, and this permeates our ways of thinking not only about the world around us but also about ourselves. And there's a particular philosophical history to this that we may talk about. So especially René Descartes in the early 1600s. Is known as the father of modern philosophy. We think of him because he came up with this. He articulated this idea of substance dualism, that the mind is a separate substance from the body, and we think about Descartes often as being the champion of the idea of the mind as completely disembodied, as immaterial, which Descartes did affirm. But just as important to Descartes' work was his affirmation that the body is a machine. And in fact, that all bodies, animal and human bodies, are machines, and all of the natural world is a matter of space and extension. So Descartes encourages us to think of nature as a machine. It didn't take long before subsequent thinkers began to apply that way of thinking of a machine to the human mind also, which Descartes would have resisted, but which others would go along with. by the time we had the rise of modern psychology and psychiatry, this idea that the human mind operated like a machine or as a machine was just kind of in the water, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that Freud picked up on. It's something that a lot of early psychologists picked up on, and therefore it shows up in our modern medical and mental health practices. I think apart from the history of it, though, I think it's just even the language that we use for ourselves often tracks with the idea of machine. So in my field of medicine, we talk a lot about burnout of physicians and nurses, pastors and others talk about this as well. But burnout is a mechanical image. Like, what else burns out? Rockets burn out, engines burn out, candles burn out. We talk about, going on vacation to recharge. Yeah. We talk about, I have my water, my coffee in front of me to, refuel, if I get hungry. These are all like mechanistic images. We talk about resilience, which is a physics image of, an immaterial object that bends but doesn't break. And all these, I think, are mechanical images that we use to apply to ourselves. And I've learned from Wendell Berry in this as well as others, but if we insist on using mechanical images for ourselves, we're eventually going to find ourselves treating ourselves like machines. Mm-hmm. And so I think one just practical thing for us all to think of is how to resist mechanical industrial images for human beings, to replace those with creaturely images. So we're not machines that burn out and need to be refueled and recharged. We're bodies. We're living creatures who need to be fed and nourished and tended and cared for and held. This is befitting our nature as like embodied creatures of God, not just artifacts or machines. I can say more about the mental health care system and how I think that embodies this, but you may want to go a different direction, Jonathan.
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about as you've been talking about the machine image is that the reason the machinery image is helpful is because it simplifies, like it takes an impossibly complex thing like the human body and simplifies. I can think about, the knee, for instance, and it does have some significant overlap with how machinery works. The knee does, and the shoulder, and all kinds of processes. But I think we can forget the fact that it's helpful because it what's the word I'm looking for? It excludes so much reality to simplify something that we can get our brains around, and then we think, aha, now I've got my brain around this thing.
Right.
And when we apply that to the mind, right, the soul, all our processes, sure. I mean, I think it's really helpful to know it's helpful because it is a gross oversimplification.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's not to say it's not helpful. It's to say it helps by excluding most of reality.
That's right.
And yet we still live with the rest of reality too.
That's right. I mean, there are ways in which these mechanical images are very helpful because you're right. So my mother has had 2 knee replacements. I'm really grateful for the surgeons who figured out how to do that and to get that done. The knee is a hinge, but it's not just a hinge. It's not a hinge just like the hinges on the hinges of my front door are. It's a knee. It's much more complex than simply calling it a hinge. The heart is a pump, but it's not the same as the pump that pumps water into our water towers to come into our houses. It's a heart. It's an organic thing. So we tend to fix on mechanical images to help us to understand the body. And the danger is when those images come to subsume our understanding of the body, or frankly, any part of the body itself, because the body is almost always more complex than any of these mechanical images. And that especially applies to the brain, and it applies to the body that relates, the body as a whole as it relates to our knowing and thinking and acting. So, I mean, there's been lots of images of what might we draw on from the language of mechanism to describe the brain? Is it a computer? Is it a neural network? What is it? And I think all of these images have some benefit, but they always fall short because the brain and the body and the mind as our ability to extend not only to our own bodies but also to the bodies of others always eludes the mechanistic images that we might apply to them. So My complaint in the book, and I make clear that, I kind of use the machine metaphor as something that I want to, in many ways, oppose. But I do think that there are times when mechanistic thinking can be helpful, and the medical model can be very helpful, which I have to describe more in detail. But I think it's the danger is when we reduce everything to mechanistic thinking, or reduce everything to the idea that we can understand mental health problems, for example, only by recourse to more and better elucidation of what's happening in the brain. I think our language always comes to an end, and we're left with some mystery that exceeds our ability to name it.
Yeah. Well, and you're coming from a long tradition here, but you talk about the idea that what it is to be human is connected very much to the reaching toward, right? Well, you're talking about wayfaring. That's the name of your book is Wayfaring. Right? We are on a journey. We're moving towards something. You say that living beings always act toward ends that we discern to be good for us.
Yeah.
Right? We are always a hammer doesn't. The user of the hammer may have a purpose for it, but the hammer doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't seek out.
Yeah.
No machine seeks out its own purpose. It has to come from outside it. And yet, what it means to be a human being is we are pursuing what we think is going to be good for us. Unfortunately, we're not very good at knowing what's good for us.
Yeah.
And that can be framed as sin. It could be framed as bad mental health. I mean, those are, I shouldn't say framed. I mean, some ways that we are bad at knowing what's good for us manifests in what's traditionally been called sin, and some of our pursuit of what's bad for us falls into the category of mental health, ill mental health. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, those are obviously complex terms that we could unpack a lot more. I think in general, you're right that one of the distinction between living creatures and inanimate objects is that, or the central distinction is that living creatures have on Aquinas' terms, have within themselves the principle of their own movement. And so Aquinas talked about living creatures having within them the capacity for nutrition and for growth and reproduction as these internal principles that are given in creation. So plants can seek the sun and can absorb nutrients and can find ways to reproduce, and animals also, and human beings also. And human beings, for Aquinas, unique among all creatures, are those that can not only do the kinds of creaturely tasks of growing and feeding and procreating and other things, but also can order our lives by according to God's ordering of the world. And so for Aquinas, humans have this God-given capacity that he referred to as the intellectual faculty of the soul to know God and to be able to know God's ordering of the world, so as to be able to regulate and to order our lives accordingly. And of course, we always do that imperfectly. We do that imperfectly in part because we're finite creatures, like we are embodied, and the fact that we're embodied means that we always are dealing with a kind of creaturely limitation, but also we're wounded by sin, and so we find ourselves like distracted in various ways and unable to see the truth of God and unable to order our lives according to the things of God. And of course, for Aquinas as a Christian, the answer to that begins with God's grace, that God in grace, specifically in the grace that comes to us in Jesus Christ, it enables us to be able to have within ourselves the capacity to once again find connection with, union with, knowledge of God and God's ordering of the world, so as to be able then to progress into the life of God. And Aquinas understood all of human life ultimately as God's good creatures. We're from God as our creator and as the one who has loved us into existence. We find ourselves now on a journey from God to God, and the end of our lives is in the life of God, in the beatific vision and union and praise of God that we we find ultimately and perfectly only in the life to come, but we find in part in this life, and even just a glimpse of that in this life is an incredible blessing for us.
Yeah. You along those lines, you say that, and again, you're following Aquinas here. We really can't understand a thing unless we understand the end toward which it is directed.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say the question of whether a person is moving toward ends or goals that are life-giving is not a neurochemical question, but a moral question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you, how are you using the word moral question there?
Yeah. Well, the part of the book where I talk about this is when we talk about Aquinas' understanding of the four causes, which he draws from Aristotle. And very briefly, without going into too much technical detail, Aquinas would have said with Aristotle that you really can't understand what a thing is. And especially he's thinking here about what we would consider like natural things like trees and frogs and human beings, without understanding four dimensions of its existence. One would be the material dimension or material cause, which is basically the matter of which we're composed. It basically means that like I'm sitting right here at this desk and no other creature can sit exactly where I am because I'm here. They'd have to push me aside to be able to do so. Another would be the formal dimension or formal cause. And by that, it means how is the matter configured? Like what's the shape and form that the matter takes? So in this case, the form of the matter of my body is not just a human body, but it's specifically me. We're in Kinghorn, this, as all of us are, a kind of unrepeatable, unique person. And he also understood the efficient cause as like those things that have enabled us to grow into the kind of creatures that we are. So that obviously begins, with the first moment of our conception and development, but it continues to, and there's a lot of different ways to understand that. And then finally, he said, you can't understand what a thing is without considering what he considered final cause, or the ends and goals toward which something is directed. This is clear. Like, let's say that you're like in a museum or going through an old, drawer in a house that's been neglected for a long time, and you find something that clearly at some point had a function, but you don't know what it was, and you're like, I can see this thing in front of me, but I don't know what it is. Like, what do we mean when we say we don't know what it is? Like we can see it's maybe a piece of metal that looks kind of sharp, but not a knife. And like we can describe that. But until somebody says, oh, that's a letter opener, then you don't actually know what it is. Like, and that applied to an artifact, something that humans have made, is an example of how sometimes to know what something is, you have to know what it's for. And Aquinas would have said the same thing about creatures, is that, we know in some ways what something is based on what it's for, and specifically the purposes and goals that constitute the life of that creature. And so we know what a snake is, or what a frog is, or what a tree is, in part by what those creatures do. And we know what a human being is, in part because human beings are those that live a human life that humans characteristically live, and a life of excellence, and that and in some ways to know somebody, to know a person, is not just to know like what matter they're composed of, or even what their body looks like, or how it's configured, or what brought that body into be, but it's to know something about them, like what kind of life are they pursuing. And that, I argue, is you can't reduce that to chemistry. Like you have to then to engage in story and narrative, and that's what I mean by these are moral questions. You can't ever get into a neurobiology lab or a physical chemistry lab and say, oh, now I understand Jonathan Rogers because I can see every way every cell of his body is put together. Because frankly, you could see all of that, but unless they knew of you as an artist, as a teacher, as someone who has had a long career in literature, and understand what that matters to you, they're not going to know you, nor any of us in this ways.
Yeah. You can tell me if I'm overstating the case, because you've thought a lot more about this than I have. But is it in any way fair to say that science, as it has been defined for the last several centuries, is trying to do the first three kinds of causes that you're talking about and skip the final cause? Is that Is that fair to say? Is that an overstatement?
I think it's mostly fair to say that modern science focuses almost exclusively on efficient causation. How does something, how do physical causes in the world cause changes that result in the phenomena that we see? Indirectly, we also scientists would also care about the matter of which something's made and the form that takes, but that's almost always brought into the language of efficient causation. That said, I think there are, and I'm not a philosopher of science. I'm certainly not a philosopher of biology, but there are those within the field of biology who argue that as much as some might want to strip like purposes and final causes away, that actually, especially when you get into into living things, you actually can't do so and still make sense of the field. So I think there is some diversity of thought.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that there's diversity of thought in that. Yeah. Because I think of, and this, probably just from surface level reading that contemporary science is sort of trying to get out of the teleology business,
Yeah. And I think there's internal debate about that, especially in philosophy of biology and certainly within psychology as well. There was ways in which the early behaviorists wanted to actually take really in some ways all subjectivity away from study of behavior. And in fact, we found that you just can't do that and make sense of the phenomena. So now modern psychology is actually a pretty diverse field where you have people don't frame it in this way, but they're often thinking of the irreducibility of story and narrative and purposes and goals as part of understanding like what it means to view a human being. So again, that's a way of saying you just can't get rid of teleology, or the idea of like to understand something, you have to understand what it's heading toward or what it's for.
Yeah. Okay. So help me bridge this idea of final cause, teleology, what a thing is for, with the idea of human agency and virtue. You write about human agency, you write about virtue, that one of the signs of mental health is, or maybe the very basis of mental health is, I have the agency to behave in ways that are, well, I'll let you define agency, but
yeah. You just used a word, agency, that's really important to me as a psychiatrist and also as a Christian. In medicine, we tend to focus on this idea of autonomy, which often has this Kantian ring to it, as someone who is in some ways a ruler of their own actions, who sets their own law. And often the language of autonomy leads us to this idea of a kind of self-contained, self-choosing, self-governing individual.
Oh yeah.
And that's different from what Aquinas meant by free will and by freedom. And I think the word agency captures it better. Let me back up and say there was a French Dominican thinker who drew on Aquinas named Servais Pinckaers, who wrote a book about 30 years ago called The Sources of Christian Ethics. And at the center of that book was a distinction between two conceptions of freedom that I think a lot of Christians will resonate with. One he called freedom of indifference. So this idea would be that this would be the kind of idea of freedom as just the capacity to do anything that we want, to have like perfect ability to choose our own path without any other constraints. And he said that's a kind of freedom that's treasured in our modern world, but it's not the best Christian understanding of freedom. Opposed to that is what he called freedom for excellence. That actually does involve constraint, and it involves law, and it involves disciplines. It involves actually submitting ourselves in some ways to certain kinds of authority, and yet the freedom that emerges in freedom for excellence is not the freedom to be free of any other kind of constraint, but it's the freedom to live a life that's consistent with what's good, and that in living a life consistent with what's good, aiming toward what's true and what's good and what's beautiful, we actually find a kind of growth of interior freedom to be able to pursue those things with joy and with relative ease, and in a way that actually we find the growth of freedom in that freedom for excellence. So when Aquinas talks about agency, or when I use the word agency to describe Aquinas' view, it's agency is not just like freedom from any kind of constraint, but it's specifically the growth of the ability to act for purposes and goals in the world, that in some ways we are the seat, or he would have said the principium, the originator of our actions. So how, when I pursue a relationship or a new academic opportunity in my role as a professor, or a new clinical opportunity in my role as a physician, or do something different with my church or something like that, how am I doing so in a way that I am choosing to do so based on reasons that are good? I'm not constrained or coerced by others, or especially by my own internal like dynamics, but to be able to do so, to freely choose to pursue a path that's consistent with what's good. And we grow in our ability to do that. And so someone who is for example, in the vice grip of addiction or a kind of substance use disorder, finds their agency constrained. They can actually choose to do things, but they can't choose freely. They find themselves like their range of action, the capacity to be that agent who's able to freely act for purposes and goals is constrained. When somebody's in a situation of significant social deprivation, they're incarcerated, or they're in a really untenable financial situation or unstable housing, also their agency is constrained because of these external things that happen. So the growth of agency is in part related to external factors, but it's also related to like how we orient ourselves toward what's good. And for Aquinas, this podcast is called Habit, and for Aquinas, habits are grooves of our thinking and acting that enable us to then be able to think and act in particular ways with ease and pleasure. And habits that are consistent with what's good are called virtues. Habits that distract us and that enclose us are called vices. And so for Aquinas, the moral life is about the cultivation of habits that enable us to act toward what's good and true and beautiful, and ultimately toward God and toward the life of God, and to be able to do so with ease and pleasure. And that's why I think the language of virtue can often seem kind of patronizing and moralizing, but I think the language of virtue is really important for thinking about mental health, but also about the work of art, because it involves, what does it mean to be able to act in a way that's free and open open to the world as it is.
Yeah, that language of ease and pleasure is, I think, can be surprising to somebody who's used to thinking of virtue as, buckle down, do the hard thing. Even the language of do hard things is a kind of a catchphrase for what it means to live a good life. And I certainly don't think that a life of virtue precludes doing hard things, but the doing of hard things, the fact that it's hard is not the clue that it's virtuous, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's right. And I think that pursuing a life of virtue does entail finding things hard, especially when we're first starting out. Yeah. But you're right that the cultivation of virtue often allows things that previously were really hard to be easier, frankly. Not always, but sometimes. Yeah. And to give a couple of concrete examples of how our modern ways of thinking about virtue, I think, doesn't actually convey what Aquinas means. Two virtues. One would be the virtue of prudence. Like when we think about prudence, one is it's a very kind of Victorian, archaic term, but also it tends to convey, like, to be prudent is to be cautious, to be constantly like almost afraid to act because we're wanting to be prudent. But for Aquinas, the virtue of prudence, or prudentia, he understood it as a cardinal virtue, and it basically is the capacity in complex situations to be able to step into difficult situations and to just have a kind of ability to sense what the right thing is to do. So think of somebody who, is just good at what they do. They can step into a room where there's tension and they just know what to say and what to do. They can step into a difficult relationship and be like, I think I have some sense of what needs to happen here. That's what prudence is for Aquinas. And it's what we all want for ourselves. And when you see it in somebody else, it's really beautiful.
I had a tow truck driver show up after a fender bender.
Yeah.
And he was amazing. He was just, his whole, all day, every day, he was coming to sit, somebody's worst day that they'd had all month. and he was just there to just to help. And
That's right.
such a great example of prudence.
That's right. It's a specific example of like he's had experience. He's kind of knows how to step into a hard situation and be like, hey, it's going to be all right. We're gonna get this taken care of. Same way, virtue of self-control. I mean, we in our culture we think of self-control or temperance as like always just restraining ourselves and like, it's so hard to be controlled about what our eating or whatever it is. But and that is part of what self-control is. But for Aquinas, self-control fundamentally has to do first with like, what does it mean to care well for ourselves, to give our bodies what our bodies actually need, instead of what we think we need that actually makes it harder for us in the long run. And so a different understanding of self-control is like, how can I actually learn to care for my body in a way that actually is sustainable and good and healthy, And so those are the different ways in which like reframing virtues away from just like things that seem, patronizing and moralizing toward things that seem life-giving and freeing, I think is really important for us.
Yeah. And, along the same lines, the way Aquinas talks about courage is it leads to cheerfulness.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
The connection between cheerfulness and courage, I think is fascinating. And you didn't use the phrase just then, but you could have said, self-control leads to ease and pleasure. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's right.
But also, you mentioned prudence as being able to step into a situation and know what to do. I think it's worth pointing out, but it's going to lead to kind of the next thing I want to talk about. The way Aquinas talked about prudence was being open to reality. That's right. Instead of defining my own reality, which, by the way, can make for a lot of misery for a lot of people.
That's right.
As I align myself with reality and resist the temptation to believe that reality is, what I want it to be, or reality is, or the desire to bend reality to my own purposes.
Yeah.
Which I think maybe in some ways, I guess that's guile. That tendency to bend, to attempt to bend reality to my own purposes.
That's right.
But the idea that there is a reality that's outside us that I didn't invent, and as I conform to that, I'm prudent, and I know, I can be the best tow truck driver in the world because I am aligned with reality. And I've stepped into a situation where people feel unmoored. I mean, there's a car accident makes you feel unmoored from reality, and this tow truck driver comes in and says, he's more moored, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
That's right. And when Aquinas talks about prudence in the Summa Theologiae, he has a list of in a kind of technical term, he calls them quasi-integral parts of prudence, but they're basically like, what are the kind of building blocks of the development of prudence? And I can't list all of them from memory, but they include things like circumspection, like the ability to just notice what's around you. They include a kind of awareness of the past, an ability to look toward the future. It does include some amount of caution, like not acting too rashly, but it also involves a kind of freedom to be able to act. It involves teachableness, you said docility or docilitas, like the ability to learn. So again, like when we think about, like now that we're having all these debates in our culture about higher education, for example, and like what is the point of education? I think some of what Aquinas writes about like these integral parts of prudence as like things that we want students to cultivate, awareness and reflection and teachableness and and caution, and I think there's a lot of wisdom there for teachers, I think, as well.
Yeah, love it. Well, you point out something I found so interesting, and that's that for Plato, an idea was something that was outside, that existed out in the universe somewhere, and I have access to it by way of the mind, but the idea is not internal to my mind. And post Descartes, we tend to think of an idea as something that's happening inside my mind, and maybe after Descartes, an idea is something that's actually inside my cranium, in the neural networks inside my head.
Eventually, maybe,
and that's, you quote Charles Taylor, the order of ideas ceases to be something that we find and becomes something we build.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That to me is something that was really helpful to think about. And I'm not primarily an intellectual historian. I've learned a lot from folks like Charles Taylor. And the book I quote from in that particular section is his older book, Sources of the Self, where he talks about like how did we come to have our modern sense of self, and he has a set of chapters on different thinkers. But in a chapter on René Descartes, who I mentioned earlier, he makes the point that that for Plato, the ideas were like existing in the world of like ultimate reality, and so knowledge was in some ways the confirmation of the mind or participation of in the mind of that involves participation in the world of ideas. Christian thinkers like Augustine, but also especially Aquinas, had a slightly different understanding of ideas as those things that were like in some ways part of God's mind. And so Aquinas talks about the divine ideas as ideas that in some ways were cognized by God, but also the ideas became, some have argued the ideas are like exemplar causes in the world. And so God, there's a divine idea that is something like an idea of a particular creature, and that the creation of particular creatures like flows from those divine ideas. Creation, Aquinas always understood creation as different from the creator is different from the creation. There was always that distinction, but yet creatures conform in some ways to exemplar ideas in the mind of God. And when Aquinas talked about like reason, like he often would talk about God's reason, God's ratio, which is in some ways God's providential ordering of the world that participates in God's mind. So in all of those eras of human history, in the early church, in the in the medieval era, to have ideas was in some ways to participate in something real outside of yourself, and ultimately to find yourself in some ways maybe even united in some way, to the mind of God. So ideas are something that you discover in the sense of like I discovered a mountain that I didn't realize was near me. There are things outside of you that, oh, well, I'm so happy to have like come into contact with this thing outside of myself. Whereas for Descartes, Descartes rejected that as any idea that that the meaning of things or the purposes of things are known within the things themselves that direct us to God. Descartes substituted that with a representational approach to knowledge, where ideas were things that not only we formed within ourselves by our own like mental activity, but that we could then gain certainty of as in some ways representing the world or the reality that's outside of us, which he understood as a world of space and extension. So Taylor argues that since Descartes, we've tended to see ideas as like things that are ours. Like I had an idea. This is my idea. It's inside me. I can patent my idea. I can write about and copyright my idea because it's mine. And he says that's just not the way that human beings would have thought before the Enlightenment. And that's Taylor's argument, and I find that very interesting.
So it seems to me there's a connection here between the idea of autonomy for Descartes, maybe, and anybody who believes that ideas in our sense of reality comes from inside. The goal will be autonomy, and the way you defined agency before as the ability to make choices that lead to excellence. From the perspective of mental health, what difference does it make whether my ideas come from inside me or whether ideas are something else?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. How do we think about mental health? I think one thing to notice is that we very rarely talk in our mental health culture about what mental health itself is. We talk a lot about mental illness, we talk about mental health problems, but we don't actually talk about mental health. And I think there's reasons for that, because frankly, it's hard to do. And when people do it, you begin to get into questions of like, what does it mean to live a well-lived human life? And that's something that we don't often want to talk about in psychiatry.
It's easier to talk about a neurochemical question than a moral question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I did in the book talk about ways that when mental health is talked about constructively, like what are some of the attributes of mental health that are framed? And I list 7, I call them natural goods of mental health. And they're personal and bodily security, positive regard for oneself and one's life, the capacity for a full range of emotion, the capacity for finding meaning, purposeful and engaging activity, the capacity for intimate and fulfilling interpersonal relationships, and the ability to respond flexibly and creatively to challenges. And those are, that's not meant to be an absolute comprehensive list. There may be others that people would add, but that kind of gets to the core of what I think modern psychologists, psychiatrists, theorists, when they talk about mental health, what they're getting to. And it's a good list. I think Christians can affirm that all of those are things that we'd want for ourselves, we'd want for our children, we'd want for our students and our, and our colleagues and our friends, our neighbors. I think the problem with that, though, is that if any of those one things is pursued for its own sake, if I live my whole life just pursuing personal security, then that becomes the goal of my life, and I end up making decisions that might prize my security, but at the cost of my relationships or at the cost of others who are made less secure by my security. If we spend our lives pursuing like intimate and fulfilling interpersonal relationships, then great, like we can pursue those. But if the point is just, if we're always asking like, is this relationship intimate and fulfilling enough? Like, have I arrived yet? Then we end up pursuing things, we value things too highly, and they end up kind of imploding in front of us sometimes. And that can be the case with any of those goods, as good as they are, pursuing, meaning. Like you can live your life pursuing meaning, but then what happens when you like all of a sudden get tired of pursuing meaning? Like, so I think this is where Aquinas would say all these are goods, but they're goods that always point us towards some other good that we're always left desiring. And he famously says, like, wealth is good, but it's not good as an end in itself. Honors are good, but it's not good as an end in itself. Health is good, but if we live our lives just pursuing health, we're going to end up disappointed, because the question is like, well, what is health for? And when we kind of keep pursuing like this question of like, what is wealth for? What are honors for? What is health for? What is mental health for? What is excellence for? Then we end up finding that what we're ultimately longing for is in some ways something that can't be satisfied by any particular thing, because we have in ourselves this kind of natural desire for God that only God can fill. And so Aquinas would say, as a Christian, and I think Christians can broadly affirm this, that our ultimate fulfillment as human beings is found in pursuing and ultimately in being united with the life of God. That, as before, we only find in full in the life to come, but we can find it in part in this life. And so that's I think a way to frame what Christians are aiming for when we think about the goal of human life, as in some ways, if God is like perfect in God's self, if God is supremely happy, then in some ways we're invited to participate in God's life. So if God is truly blessed, then we can find in this life a kind of participation in the blessedness that God is and God's blessing. So that's why when I try to think about how to translate Aquinas' Latin term beatitudo, which would be a kind of his interpretation of Aristotle's term eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness or flourishing, I think both of those are good, but they're not sufficient. So I render that term as participation in blessing. We live our lives pursuing, in some ways, God. We find by participation like a glimpse of the life of God. That's participation in blessing, and that's the end and goal of our lives as human beings, Christians would say. And the goods of mental health are goods that we can find along the way. I think I would say.
Yeah.
But
I love
the goal
that
of our life is not mental health.
Participation and blessing, and the assumption that the blessings are there, and we participate. We don't create the blessings.
No.
We put ourselves in the way of the blessing. We put ourselves in a position to receive.
That's right. And true blessedness, it is in the very life of God. And so like we just like get to participate in it just a little bit, like a time when you like, you have a sense of, wow, something happened there. I felt myself opening in some ways to something that doesn't feel like it just came from me, that I'm somehow participating in something broader than me. And that's when we begin to feel that and experience that in this life. Yeah.
I know you're a Pieper reader, and I love Pieper's formulation that to love a thing is to agree with God that it's good. The God who made this thing and said this is good, is to agree. That feels like a kind of participation and blessing. to be able to agree with God that the good things God made are indeed good.
Yes, and Pieper's affirmation that I've saying almost every time I talk to a group that, when he meditates on Genesis 1:31, and he asks, like, what does it mean for God to see all that God has made and behold it's very good? And he says it's something like approval, not approval for every state of affairs or for everything that happens, but God's approval for the basic existence of the creature. That for God to look at the creation and say it's good is to say it's good that you exist.
Yeah.
It's good that you're in this world. And man, that's just something we need to be able to say to each other as God says it to us.
Yeah. Ward, I'm so glad that your book exists. I hope a lot of people read it and get as much good out of it as I did. And Barrett, I'm glad you exist too. Thanks for being here.
I'm glad that you exist, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.